Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This is our second episode on open theism. We talk with Patrick Todd about the open future open theist view.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Patrick Todd, who's a Chancellor's Fellow and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. Patrick has written many articles on free will and moral responsibility, including several on freedom and foreknowledge in particular. He's the co-editor with John Martin Fisher of a terrific volume called Freedom, Fatalism, and Foreknowledge, which was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press. And that volume has a very helpful introduction to these issues by Patrick and John, which I'd recommend. And more recently, Patrick has written a book called The Open Future: Why Future Contingents Are All False, which was published earlier this year, that is 2022, by Oxford University Press. And some of that material from the book will probably come up in our conversation today. Welcome to the show, Patrick. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Hi, Taylor. Hi, Matt. Thanks so much, first of all, for having me on this podcast. It's super fun to talk to you guys.
Thanks for joining us.
How did I get into this? Well, I think from the earliest stages of my interest in philosophy, I was just interested in problems having to do with God and free will, especially the foreknowledge problem. So this problem really troubled me as, a young theist in high school and early college. Mm-hmm. I think I'm not alone in that respect, right? I mean, this is a problem that troubles a lot of theists. And so, I think, from the time I was 18, I was really interested in this problem. And it's maybe one of the core problems that sent me down the path of philosophy. I remember being in something like, I think, Introduction to Philosophy, or it might have been a second year philosophy class, and a professor mentioned, gave a quick gloss of open theism, and I was absolutely scandalized. I was like, what? People think this is crazy, but I was attracted to it in a sense, from the start, and thought, this is really, really interesting. So, been interested in the free will issue for a long time, not just in connection to issues in philosophy of religion, but just more generally. So I think maybe I'll end there for the minute.
Yeah. This is our second episode on open theism, and our first focused on introducing the view and the reasons for accepting it. We want to dig a little deeper in this episode, and you've introduced a helpful distinction between two versions of open theism: limited foreknowledge open theism and open future open theism, and you opt for the open future version. Could you say a bit about what you mean by saying that the future is open, and then explain the difference between your version of open theism and limited foreknowledge?
Yeah, so the core idea is this, that on the limited foreknowledge open theistic view, there are truths about, say, what Taylor is going to freely do tomorrow. It's just that for one reason or another, God doesn't know them. I mean, the standard thing to say there is that God can't know them. It's somehow not possible for God to know them. But the concession, as it were, that the limited foreknowledge open theist is making is that, there are some truths that God doesn't know. The core difference between that view and the open future open theistic view is just that the open futurist just says, look, where the limited foreknowledge person says that there are truths that God doesn't know, the open futurist just tries to say there are no such truths in the first place, right? So there are just no facts specifying what any genuinely free agent is going to do. And so because knowledge implies truth, of course, God wouldn't know these facts or know these truths. There just aren't any. And so this is the kind of sense in which the future is open, or is kind of meant to be the sense in which the future is open. There are no truths about indeterministic events. I mean, that's at least a decent first pass of what I at least mean by the open future view. So that's the core difference, at least, between the two ideas.
Yeah. I've heard some people use this analogy between God not being able to do certain things and God not being able to know certain things because, for instance, like God can't do things that are logically impossible. Is this kind of analogy? Is this something that you think is a helpful analogy when comparing what God can do and what God can know?
I think that analogy comes up mostly in defense of this limited foreknowledge idea. So some of those people will say, look, I mean, sure, I'm saying that God can't know, or let's just say doesn't know what let's say Taylor is going to do tomorrow. But look, I mean, this is no problem for omniscience because knowing these truths is impossible. And so it's some kind of way of trying to preserve, if not the letter, the spirit of the doctrine of divine omniscience. Because, look, I mean, these truths are impossible to know. And there might be something to that. I don't think that that's a decent way of preserving the doctrine of divine omniscience, because in the end, you still are saying there are some truths that this being doesn't know. As far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the story. This being's not omniscient. It might not be ultimately a problem that this being isn't omniscient, because you might want to say, on reflection, it's not really possible to be omniscient in a context in which there are free agents. And so it is a kind of point in defense of limited foreknowledge open theism. But I mean, I think the good news for me is that I don't have to say anything.
Right. Yeah. So on your view, God doesn't know what I'm freely going to do tomorrow. But that's not because he's sort of like shielding his eyes and making sure that the truth about what I'll do tomorrow isn't known by him, and therefore doesn't sort of take away my free will. But on your view, there's no truth about what I'll freely do tomorrow.
I think
is that right? Okay.
Except, I mean, I'll stick up for the limited foreknowledge folks for a second. I don't think really any of them are super keen to say that God, as it were, shields his metaphorical eyes. I mean,
right.
He doesn't have eyes. He doesn't have. I mean, it's just they're going to say something like this. Look, when what Taylor is going to do is undetermined, there's nothing on the basis of which God could form a reliable belief about what Taylor's going to do. And for that reason, God is going to have to withhold belief about something like that. It's not so much that it's like God kind of like, doesn't peek behind the curtain or something. It's like that I think is maybe not the best thing for them to say. But right. I mean, I think otherwise, you nailed it.
Well, turning to your view, I mean, it kind of sounds, if you say there's no truth about what I'll do tomorrow, it kind of reminds me of conversations we've had with John Fisher and with Alicia Finch about Aristotle and the sea battle argument. It seemed like, I mean, both of our guests referred to different interpretations of Aristotle. We don't need to get into that, but how's your view similar to Aristotle's, where he says there's not a truth about whether there will be a sea battle tomorrow, if that's contingent. And maybe if you think you do part ways with Aristotle, could you say how?
Yeah, so good. I mean, my open future view is, it belongs in the long, long tradition of thought stemming from Aristotle's famous discussion of the sea battle tomorrow on Interpretation 9. So, right, I do not engage in Aristotle scholarship, but let's just say, as you say, that the Aristotelian view is that right now, let's say, the claim that there will be a sea battle tomorrow is neither true nor false. That's how lots of people have interpreted Aristotle. So in this way, he gives up the principle of bivalence, which says that any proposition is, if not true, then false, right? True and false are the only two truth values, and any proposition, if it doesn't have one, it's got the other. And the thought is that, okay, Aristotle gives that up with regards to future contingents. I mean, a future contingent is going to be a claim about what's going to happen where there are ways things could go from here where that thing happens, and ways things could go from here where it doesn't. Okay, that's, I mean, the rough gloss on future contingent. So, in this kind of way, Aristotle says future contingents are neither true nor false. So my view has a great deal in common with the Aristotelian view. I almost want to, it's like to emphasize the differences is almost, like in the scheme of things is maybe to take us down the wrong path, like, because I have much more in common with Aristotle or the Aristotelian view in this respect than I would have in common with, say, an alchemist or a determinist or a Molinist or someone like that. So, but still, there are some key differences. And just, I mean, simply the key difference is that where Aristotle says that future contingents are neither true nor false, I just say they're false. So in this kind of way, I mean, I'm trying to say the gap between the untrue and the false is really not that important. If you kind of took seriously the idea that these claims are, as of right now, untrue, it's like it's untrue that there will be a sea battle. It's untrue that there will fail to be a sea battle. If you can kind of get your head around that a little bit, then I'm trying to say, actually, there's a better view here is just to say that both of those claims are false. So it's false that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. It's also false that there will fail to be a sea battle tomorrow. That's the core difference that I have with Aristotle. And I mean, to I don't know, try to summarize an entire book, I try to say that, this view has got a lot of theoretical advantages over a view that says that these claims are indeterminate or something like that. We just don't need to revise logic in order to go down this path.
Yeah. If you were to give like an elevator pitch for the main reasons why you think they're all false, what would those reasons be?
There is no elevator pitch.
You gotta go buy the book.
Yeah, I know. That's the horrible truth of the matter. I mean, it's kind of a long slog. I mean, you could look. There are different ways you could go here. I mean, one is just that it's like bivalence seems like a decent principle. If you had otherwise thought, hey, bivalence seems like a decent principle, well, I mean, we've reasoned ourselves into the conclusion that these claims aren't true. Why not now just accept that they're false? And then more or less what I'm trying to do from there is just say, actually, objections to that view are completely overblown. I mean, there's no compelling argument against the view that they're false. So, I mean, if I had to give an elevator pitch, that could be it. But, I mean, quickly, Matt, I think broadly speaking, I try to say that this view that future contingents all come out false, it's sort of motivated by an overall picture of the semantics of will, of this, what's called, a modal, and I try to develop what I think of as like an independently plausible modal semantics for will, on which will is a kind of, a bit of fancy jargon here, but it's a universal quantifier. And And once you swallow that, then you're going to see that in combination with this open future view, the natural meaning of will is just going to render these claims false. I mean, there, that was a long elevator ride. How about
That's great. I guess one quick clarification. So the disagreement between you and then this interpretation of Aristotle, where we give up bivalence about future, at least about these future contingents, you could be an open theist with either of those views, and you would still count as an open future open theist, right? And so you'd be disagreeing with other open theists who say that there are truths about the future that God doesn't know. Is that right?
I think that's right. I mean, there's kind of in the first pass, two camps of open theists. There's the limited foreknowledge folks, and then the open future folks. And then within the open future people, now there can be differences in that. There can be some of those people who say that future contingents are neither true nor false, or you could say future contingents are false. You can also try a third thing, which I won't try to mention right now. But right, then there can be different divisions within the open future camp.
Good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. You have several papers on divine foreknowledge and human free will that critically engage the other positions, especially the dependence response to the argument for incompatibilism about free will and divine foreknowledge. Are you an open theist because you see these responses as unsuccessful, or because of your view about the openness of the future, or something else, or maybe a combination?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, why do I like open theism? Just holding fixed the theism part. Let's not. I mean, why be a theist at all? Good question. I don't know, but theist hat on anyway. Why be an open theist, or why am I attracted to open theism? A couple different reasons. I mean, one reason, is that there's this famous argument, or much discussed argument from the last, say, 60 odd years, which purports to show that divine foreknowledge would be inconsistent with human freedom to do otherwise. And I know that you all have had podcast episodes about this argument. That argument strikes me as extremely compelling. It just strikes me as compelling that if an infallible being has beliefs in advance about what Taylor is going to do tomorrow, Taylor's not free to do otherwise, because Taylor isn't free to make that being wrong. And so, look, divine foreknowledge is inconsistent with human freedom to do otherwise. Insofar as you thought we do have freedom to do otherwise, or it's important that we would have such freedom, that gives you some reason to go with the open theist type of view. So that's one direct reason. But then there's this other reason, and I do think that these reasons are sort of related. I mean, they kind of form a picture together. There's a sort of global picture. But I mean, broadly speaking, the other reason I have is just by thinking about the nature of truth and time and explanation. So, I'm one of these people who finds it very weird to think that there could be truths about what Taylor's going to do tomorrow when, things right now, together with laws of nature and whatever else you want to add in, things right now don't settle it. It's like, there are ways things could go from here where Taylor, let's say, mows his lawn tomorrow, and ways things could go from here in which Taylor doesn't mow his lawn tomorrow. I find it strange that there could just be some primitive fact to the effect that actually, Taylor will mow his lawn tomorrow. I mean, where would that fact come from? So I've always thought that's kind of strange. I mean, it's strange to think that there are these truths kind of that float free from what current reality and law dictates. And that kind of motivation is what, it's what you might consider something like a reductionist type of motivation, or like maybe a desert landscapes sort of motivation. I kind of have this picture that all of these truths about about what's to come have to reduce to facts about what the present is like and what the laws of nature are like. And so, given indeterminism, it's going to follow that there are no truths about things like, what indeterministic processes, how they're going to get resolved. So that's my other view, is that, just from thinking about the nature of truth. And so, like, because I think it would be weird for there to be truths like this, I also think it would be weird if these were known, because, look, I think that there are no such truths.
Yeah. Well, earlier you mentioned when you first heard about open theism in college that you were sort of scandalized by it. Do you think that accepting open theism, and maybe the open future version in particular, has any implications for other commitments, whether theological? It seems like that might have been what you were scandalized by then, or maybe, other philosophical commitments.
Yeah, definitely. So, right. I remember when I heard about this view for the first time, I thought, oh, like, what could these people be thinking? Because surely this can't be made consistent with like any, decent interpretation of, Hebrew, Christian, Islamic, scriptural texts and, other religious commitments. I had probably this reaction. It's like, well, that's an extremely fascinating view that can't possibly be one that, like, actual theists can endorse. Insofar as these people are want to be religiously faithful. You could, maybe there's like some, like, totally, I don't know, like a philosopher's God type of view, but anyway, it's got nothing to do with traditional religion. That's kind of what I was thinking. Eventually, I read some people who kind of convinced me that there's at least something to be said for, putting traditional religious conviction together with open theism, but it didn't strike me as super convincing, to be honest with you. I thought, what, these open theist, like, people, they're kind of bending a lot of these scriptural texts around in all sorts of funny ways, doing a bunch of, super creative, too creative theological exegesis of, like, key religious texts. It all looks pretty, desperate. And yeah, I personally, that's how I looked at it. I thought, what? But the thing is that at this point, like, everyone is just saying ridiculous things, and is the open theist saying anything more ridiculous than anybody else? I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. So I do think it's definitely got some knock-on effects in, I don't know how you're going to be able to handle, certain like authoritative religious texts, things that you might, see in the Bible, or, but more generally, of course, it's got knock-on effects with doctrine of providence, how God stands the time. Whole panoply of things to come up. So, yeah, happy to discuss any of those further, but
yeah.
Sidebar, I kind of think, yeah, it's interesting to observe that, open theism doesn't fit so well with, sacred texts, but I don't know. The other, thing you could mention here is like, yeah, open theism is not going to fit well with what you might think of as classical picture, a classical picture of God,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of picture you get in Aquinas, where God is atemporal, immutable, simple. Open theism just doesn't really jive with that type of view.
Right.
And whether you think of that as a cost is sort of a question of your more general philosophical outlook on theism. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so there are some things to say there. There's also the problem of evil. I mean, but here you might think that open theism really helps because it's only really going to be on this view that God is going to be creating, and if God is going to create free agents, God can't be doing this in advance knowledge of precisely what these creatures are going to do.
Right.
And you might think that if that were the divine predicament, as it were, then that would explain or help to explain, in some sense, the facts of evil. It's like, look, I mean, the world is partly as bad as it is because, to create free agents is essentially to take a risk.
Mm-hmm.
That's a view that open theists are in good position to accommodate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful to mention.
We've already talked a little bit about divine omniscience. So one initial worry that people might have about this version of open theism is that it seems like it gives up omniscience, since it says that God does not know in advance what people will freely do or what free agents will freely do. What do you make of this worry? Do you think that we're going to have to give up omniscience if we accept your view of open theism?
I think it's pretty clear that no, we don't. I mean, to be honest, I think that this objection, it's pretty clear that this doesn't work against the open future view. It's going to work against the limited foreknowledge view, but the whole idea of the open future view is just to say that there are no truths in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So, look, I mean, omniscience is going to imply something like knowledge of every truth, or if a claim is true, then the being knows that claim. And yeah, I can plainly accept that. I'm going to say for any truth, God knows that truth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fact that I think that there are less truths than you do might be a kind of problem for me. I mean, maybe that is a ridiculous thing to think. That there aren't truths of the kind that I'm saying. Maybe that's a ridiculous view, but it would be a mistake to try to criticize that view as giving up omniscience. I mean,
Right.
So yeah, I think it's a totally fair complaint to say, hey, wait, like pre-theoretically, it seems fine to think that there are truths about what Taylor's going to, eat for lunch tomorrow. Even assuming that he could do something else, it's totally get that. But I think that that's independent of the omniscience worry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Going back to that analogy I mentioned before, it seems like it fit, if we explain it in a certain way, it would fit better with your view that, well, yeah, God doesn't know what a square circle looks like either. So would it be the same kind of forcefulness? Like, well, he doesn't know that because it's logically impossible. Is your argument going to end up with that conclusion that it's logically impossible for God to know these things because they're all false?
Well, yeah. I mean, I do think it's logically impossible to know what's false. Now, it's tricky because let's just take the claim that Taylor will have lunch at noon tomorrow. Is it logically? Let's just say, is it let's say that is a future contingent. Well, things might have developed in a different way so that wouldn't have expressed the future contingent at all. So, I mean, I think the thing to say here is that, yeah, I mean, it's going to be logically impossible for God to know a future contingent. But just because some claim is a future contingent, it doesn't mean that necessarily that claim is a future contingent.
Right, yeah.
So a proposition that in fact expresses a future contingent at a time needn't have expressed the future contingent at that time. So there's a sense in which, right, I mean, just because I'm saying that God can't know future contingents, it's not... Yeah, I mean, I'm not thereby saying it's logically impossible that God know that, let's say, Taylor has lunch for... lunch at noon tomorrow. Had things developed in a way that wasn't a future contingent, that would have been known by God. Tricky, yeah, I don't know. Some tricky issues there, Matt. But yeah, maybe I'll rest there.
If I can ask about one tricky issue here, or one that maybe isn't that tricky, but it could seem tricky, it might be that like Matt knows that I'm gonna get up and mow my lawn tomorrow and then have lunch at noon. Like, I don't know, I'm pretty regimented. I have a good to-do list. I'm pretty reliable. I've told Matt about my plans. Could suppose that the world's indeterministic. It's not settled now in any sort of deterministic way that I'm going to mow my lawn or eat my lunch at noon. But it seems like Matt could know that, or at least that he could correctly predict that I'll do those things. So what do you make of that? I mean, it seems like it would be a problem if Matt could know something that God couldn't. But maybe you'll want to say, I know you will want to say, Matt doesn't really know. It's not true that I'm going to do this thing. So Matt doesn't really know it.
Good question, Taylor. And yeah, you've kind of anticipated my response. But let's just say this, that, yeah, I mean, I think this is a serious objection to open future, open theism. I mean, well, let me back up. I mean, there is one kind of objection here, which is just that, you know, it looks like we have lots of knowledge of future contingents, and I'm saying that we don't. Okay, there is a kind of objection there. I actually think, though, that the point that you're raising here is really a point against limited foreknowledge open theism. So they are definitely gonna, it looks like, face this type of problem. That we have knowledge of lots of claims that God doesn't. So, you know, on that type of view, there are truths about what's going to happen tomorrow, which are not settled by current reality. And unless you take a hardcore skeptical view, it looks like we're going to know some of those, like examples that you mentioned. Maybe I know that my wife is going to pick me up from the office by 6 p.m. today. I know that in the normal way. If we imagine looking from the outside that's true, only a skeptic is going to say, I don't know it, and so, but now the limited foreknowledge open theist is going to say that's not something that God can know because it's not settled. And now it looks like humans have some knowledge that God doesn't have. That looks kind of bad. I mean, what's up with that? And yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple things that they could say there, kind of, it's like parallel maybe to what Aquinas says about omnipotence in some places, where it's like, yeah, there's a sense in which, or sure, human beings can know things like this, but God can't. But that's somehow because we are deficient in certain ways. Like, we are idiots who can take like massive epistemic risks and things like that. And we believe on faulty evidence and so it's because of a defect that we can know in this way. But God doesn't have any defects like that. Okay, well, whether that's convincing or not, I don't know. But But right, I mean, the hard problem for me is more like I'm just going to have to straight up deny that, if it really is a future contingent that, I forget your example, Taylor, it was maybe
Lunch at noon tomorrow,
yeah,
or
lunch
mowing
at
the lawn.
noon. Like you have lunch at noon, every week with your colleague on Wednesdays. Like it's everything is on again. Now, I'm just going to have to say, look, I mean, no, you don't. I mean, insofar as we also know right now that it's undetermined.
Mhm.
That genuinely there are some ways things could go from here where you don't get lunch at noon. Then I'm going to just have to say, look, I mean, there's currently no fact of the matter about whether that's what you're going to do, so you don't know. No, I mean, this is weird. I mean, definitely, this is I think not how we normally think. And so, I mean, in this respect, I just totally accept that the open future view is pretty out of step with ordinary, well, in some sense, an ordinary picture of truth and time. It's not a very, it's a very revisionary view in lots of ways, and this is just a kind of manifestation of that. It's kind of like saying, like, look, I mean, I'm not saying that like you don't know. Like, I mean, one way of trying to say, Taylor, that like you don't know that you're going to have lunch tomorrow at noon is like by starting to raise a bunch of skeptical worries. Like, well, how do you know you're not going to get hit by a bus? Stuff like that. Like,
Right.
and I'm not doing that. I'm not trying to be a skeptic. Like, oh, like, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat, Taylor? Like, so you don't really know that like you're going to have lunch because like you don't even know that you have a mouth. So like, I'm not trying to be a skeptic in the classical way. I'm just saying, actually, there are no truths in this domain. Now, if there were some truths in that domain, I'd be happy to grant that you know them. It's just for whatever, for these reasons, I've tried to deny that there are. It's kind of like a moral skeptic who says, like, there are no moral facts. And so, look, I mean, if you protest, like, but I know that stealing is wrong. It's like, I mean, man, like, if there were some moral facts, I'd be happy to grant that would be one that you knew. But I just, in my ontology, so to speak, I just don't have any of those facts in the first place. So of course I'm going to deny that you know them. Not because I'm some weird skeptic guy. It's just because I'm skeptical about the existence of these truths. So yeah, but I think that the open future view is definitely a bit weird on this front.
Yeah, I wonder though. So you think you kind of have to give up the ordinary picture of truth and time, but maybe you'll want to say there's something. It's not quite right that it's true that I'll have lunch at noon tomorrow, or that anyone knows that. Right? That's not quite right. But maybe you think there's something in the way we talk about the future that like something in the vicinity that's right. Like,
yeah,
maybe you'll want to explain why we say, yeah, I know Taylor's going to have lunch at noon tomorrow, but we wouldn't say, oh yeah, I know Taylor's going to like ride a dragon at noon tomorrow. Or something like that.
Yeah, right. I've heard some open theists like try to salvage this by talking about probabilities and how God is like a master chess player, and given what he knows about the present, he's able to predict with varying degrees of reliability, kind of like you're going to wake up tomorrow, or.
I do think that that's definitely something open theists should say, because I mean, I would want to say that there are some truths about probabilities, probabilities of sea battle tomorrow, probabilities of Taylor having lunch at noon, and God would know those because God's omniscient. But yeah, I mean, that I don't think exactly addresses Taylor's worry, though, which is like, look, I mean, just if we just focus on normal conversations, when I leave my weird philosophy office, like probably within 6 seconds, I'm going to go back to the ordinary way of thinking and talking. Like maybe my wife is going to call me and I'll be like, look, I'll be home in like 20 minutes. Or like, don't worry, like the train the train will leave in like 2 hours. We've got plenty of time. So I'm just going to like blithely assert all of these claims, like, oh yeah, like, well, my mom will be here, over Christmas, so like, don't, this and that. Okay, now what if Taylor like followed me out of here, and then like, was like, pause, wait a second, Patrick, you just said like your mom will be here, like what you just said by your own lights is false, what do I have to say for myself? I mean, this is the problem that I address in the final chapter of my book. It's dealing with what I'm calling the assertion problem. And here my response is basically just like, yeah, you got me. Like, I said something that's probably false, but who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, why? Because, although in this kind of way, I mean, it might be that I'm asserting what's false, but I'm still communicating what's true. And I think that it's fine that we few open futurists, like me, and I can probably name like 4 other people who believe this kind of crazy view. I don't think it's incumbent on us to like inflict our crazy metaphysical view on the world and try to like always make sure to never talk about what will happen except for when like the laws of physics necessitate it. It's like that would just make for an impossible way of like operating in the world, and I just don't think that that's morally required of us. So I'm just happy to be like, yeah, I mean, I don't care. Like I probably assert things like this that are false all the time. But look, I mean, these false assertions do nevertheless convey truths, and that's why my practice is still appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think there are any other kind of big objections or challenges, either for your view about the open future or for open theism? Maybe pick one and say how you'd respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, so good. I mean, I kind of think of open theism as, it's like the conjunction of theism and then the open future view. Well, I mean, focusing on open future, open theism. Right. So one sort of thing to push or, note is just, yeah, I mean, how can the open theists make sense of traditional religious doctrines? Things like to me, I just think, yeah, open theism is like a super religiously revisionary picture of things. It's not clear how it's going to make sense together with divine revelation if you believe in that. And I think, yeah, that's a tough project. But philosophically, I mean, I think that the primary objections, well, in some sense, I try to deal with them as best as I can in the book that I've published. But the primary objections are just to try to overcome this feeling that, first of all, there's something logically incoherent about this view, and second, something practically incoherent. So it's a view that is so out of step with how we practically live our lives that we can't believe it. I think that neither of those two problems are really decisive in the end, but it's it's no simple matter. Let's just say those objections, but. I think it's a fascinating area and one that, as far as I can see, is, well, see, here I'm about to assert a future contingent. are just, yeah, I mean, I slipped back in exactly to the mode that, I think is perfectly fine. But
before you even left the philosophy office.
and I'm in the philosophy office. That's, it's so hard to kind of, I mean, well, like I said, there's just no reason to try to regulate speech in this way. But I mean, I think this topic is one that is only growing. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's still one that is not going away and is, promises to, keep exciting people and keep vexing people some time to come. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, this has been great, Patrick. Thanks so much for joining us. If our listeners want to check out more of your work, where can they go to find what you're working on?
Thanks. Two places. One is my Phil Papers profile. If you just search for Patrick Todd and Phil Papers, I keep that up to date. The other thing is my website, patricktodd.co, and those two places.
Great.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks again, Patrick.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been super fun.
Thank you.
In our next episode, which will be the final episode of this season, we'll talk about the view that accepts not only that freedom and foreknowledge are compatible, but also that freedom and causal determinism are compatible. Our guest will be Greg Welty, professor of philosophy at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary.